the phantom limb of control. What terrifies him most is not her strength, but the sudden amputation of his imagined dominion. There's an old Hungarian folk tale about a woodcutter who spent his life believing his shadow gave him power over the forest. Every morning, he'd watch his shadow stretch across fallen logs and moss-covered stones, and he'd whisper to himself, "See how I command even the darkness." Then, one winter morning, under an overcast sky, his shadow disappeared entirely. The man stood paralyzed for hours, convinced he had lost his very soul, when all that had vanished was an illusion he'd confused with his essence. Men and strong women. Sighs. It's the same grotesque theater, isn't it? Except the woodcutter's delusion was charming in its innocence. What we're dealing with is far more sinister, a collective fever dream that mistakes psychological dependency for masculine identity. Watch a man encounter a woman who doesn't flinch at his raised voice, doesn't dissolve when he withdraws his approval, doesn't beg for his attention like a starved sparrow. Something ancient and terrible awakens in his chest, not desire, not even hatred, but a kind of existential vertigo. The ground beneath his carefully constructed selfhood begins to crumble, revealing the quicksand foundation he spent decades ignoring. You see, most men don't fear strong women because they're intimidating. They fear them because they're unnecessary. There's nothing quite like watching someone flourish in your absence to make you question whether you were ever essential at all. It's the difference between being wanted and being needed. And God help the man who's built his entire identity on the latter, because a strong woman will expose that architecture as the house of cards it always was. The research emerging from behavioral psychology labs tells us something deliciously uncomfortable. Men who score highest on traditional masculinity scales show the most physiological stress responses: elevated cortisol, increased heart rate, muscle tension, when presented with scenarios of female competence and independence. Their bodies betray what their minds refuse to acknowledge. They've been living in a simulation, and someone just unplugged the machine. But here's where it gets properly eerie, like candlelight flickering against velvet curtains. The terror isn't really about her at all. It's about the sudden recognition that he's been performing masculinity rather than inhabiting it. Every door he's opened, every problem he's solved, every moment of protective instinct. Was it genuine strength, or just the elaborate choreography of someone desperate to feel necessary? There's a particular breed of man who becomes violently uncomfortable when a woman pays for dinner, fixes her own car, travels alone to foreign countries, or, heaven forbid, seems genuinely content in her solitude. He'll frame it as concern, as tradition, as biology. But strip away the rhetoric and you'll find something more primitive. The primal scream of someone whose reason for existing just walked out the door without looking back. Kierkegaard wrote about the concept of anxiety of freedom, that peculiar dread that comes when we realize we're responsible for creating our own meaning. For many men, women's dependence has been their meaning-making machine, grinding out purpose and identity with the reliability of a textile mill. A strong woman doesn't just reject that dynamic. She reveals it was never there to begin with. She's not his shadow. She never was. And the phantom limb aches where his imagined control used to be. I've seen men sabotage relationships with remarkable women for no reason they could articulate, driven by some subterranean terror they couldn't name. They'd pick fights about nothing, withdraw emotionally, create problems where none existed, anything to restore the familiar dynamic where her happiness depended on his approval. Because if she doesn't need him to save her, to fix her, to complete her, then who is he exactly? The most honest among them will admit, in those 3 a.m. moments when the ego's defenses are down, that her strength makes them feel like frauds. Not because she's doing anything to them, but because she's revealing what they've always known and spent their lives trying to hide. That their masculine identity was borrowed, not built. That they've been wearing their father's clothes and hoping nobody would notice the fit was all wrong. There's something almost beautiful in this terror, if you can stomach the tragedy of it. It's the fear of someone who's spent so long looking in a funhouse mirror that they've forgotten their actual face. When a strong woman appears, Clear-eyed, self-possessed, gloriously unconcerned with his approval, she becomes an unwitting reminder of all the authentic strength he's never cultivated in himself. Do you recognize him, this phantom limb man? Have you been him? Are you him now? Reading these words and feeling that familiar tightness in your chest? Half recognition, half denial. What would happen if you stopped performing strength and started building it? The archaeologist of wounds, she excavates the pain he's spent his life burying, and he mistakes her shovel for a weapon. A confession, whispered like smoke through cracked lips. She doesn't mean to be cruel when she sees through him. It's just that strong women develop a particular kind of vision. The way night creatures learn to navigate by starlight. She's learned to read the topography of hidden suffering. And men, God help them, are walking museums of unexamined trauma, their pain fossilized into personality traits they've mistaken for strength. There's something unsettling about being truly seen, isn't there? Not the performance version of yourself you've perfected for public consumption, but the raw, unedited footage. The parts where you're still that 7-year-old boy who learned that crying meant weakness, that needing comfort meant failure, that emotional expression was something shameful to be locked away like a family secret. I once knew a man who claimed he wasn't afraid of anything. Successful, confident, the sort who walked into rooms and commanded attention without trying. But put him near a woman who could sit comfortably in silence, who didn't rush to fill every pause with reassurance or distraction, and he'd begin to disintegrate. Not dramatically, that would be too honest. Instead, he'd become aggressively cheerful, frantically charming, desperately performing any character except himself. You see, silence has weight, and strong women have learned to wield it like a scalpel, not to hurt, but simply because they're comfortable existing without constant validation. They don't need to be entertained, managed, or protected from their own thoughts. This terrifies men who've spent decades running from theirs. The latest neuroscience research reveals something fascinating and terrible. Men who report the highest levels of traditional masculine stress show increased amygdala activation when exposed to emotional intimacy scenarios. Their brains literally perceive vulnerability as danger, treating a heart-to-heart conversation the same way they'd respond to a physical threat. 30 years of being told that feelings are feminine will rewire your neural pathways into knots that would make Houdini weep. But here's where the story gets properly gothic. Strong women don't create this fear. They simply refuse to enable the elaborate defense mechanisms men have built around it. They won't pretend not to notice when he changes the subject every time the conversation turns real. They won't accept "I'm fine" as a complete emotional vocabulary. They won't participate in the grand charade where his feelings don't exist as long as nobody acknowledges them directly. She becomes, quite accidentally, an archaeologist of wounds he spent his life ensuring would never see daylight. Not because she's prying or invasive, but because her own emotional intelligence creates a gravitational field that pulls truth out of hiding. She mentions, casually, that he seems sad lately, and suddenly he's 8 years old again, watching his father leave for the 3rd time, swearing he'll never let anyone have that power over him again. This is why he'll call her too intense, too emotional, too much. It's easier to pathologize her depth than to acknowledge his own shallowness. Easier to frame her emotional literacy as instability than to admit he's functionally illiterate in the language of his own inner life. There's a particular cruelty in how society prepares men for this failure. We teach boys that emotional competence is optional, that they can outsource their feeling life to women who will serve as their interpreters, their emotional secretaries, their designated feelers. Then we act surprised when they encounter women who refuse the job, who expect them to show up as fully formed human beings capable of introspection and self-awareness. The strong woman doesn't try to fix him. That's crucial to understand. She's not his therapist, his mother, or his rehabilitation center. She simply exists as proof that emotional maturity is possible, that you can feel deeply without falling apart, that you can be vulnerable without being weak. And this proof is exactly what he can't bear, because it highlights every opportunity for growth he's avoided, every moment of authentic connection he's sabotaged, Every time he chose numbness over the messy beauty of actually living. I've watched men end relationships with women they claim to love, not because of anything she did, but because her emotional fluency made them feel like children in an adult world. She'd try to have conversations about feelings, needs, fears, dreams, the basic vocabulary of intimacy. And he'd respond like she was speaking in tongues, alternately baffled and resentful that she expected him to participate in this foreign language. The most tragic cases are the ones who mistake their emotional constipation for stoicism, their fear of feeling for strength. They'll quote Marcus Aurelius and Seneca, not understanding that the Stoics were advocating for emotional intelligence, not emotional absence. True stoicism requires you to understand your feelings deeply enough to choose your response to them wisely. What they're practicing is closer to emotional bulimia, starving themselves of feeling until they're sick with the absence of it. Tell me, when was the last time you let yourself feel something completely? Not the edited version, not the socially acceptable portion, but the full catastrophic beauty of human emotion. Do you even remember what that feels like? Or have you been playing dead so long you've forgotten you're alive? The witch trial of independence. Her self-sufficiency becomes evidence of his superfluity, and he appoints himself both judge and executioner. Picture this: a courtroom that exists only in his mind, where her every act of independence becomes evidence in a trial she doesn't know she's on trial for. The crime, making him feel unnecessary. The sentence, a slow campaign of subtle sabotage disguised as love. It begins innocently enough. She mentions she's thinking of taking a solo trip to Prague, and something cold slithers behind his eyes. Not jealousy. That would be too honest, too clean. This is something more insidious. The creeping dread that she might discover she likes her own company better than his. That she might return with stories that don't include him, experiences that prove she can be whole without his witness. There's an old Salem legend about a woman who was accused of witchcraft for the crime of living alone and seeming happy about it. The townspeople couldn't fathom how she survived without male protection, how she managed her own affairs, how she walked through the world with her head held high and no man's name to legitimize her existence. Surely, they reasoned, she must have made a pact with the devil. No normal woman could be that complete. Fast forward 4 centuries, and we're still burning witches. We've just gotten more sophisticated about it. Now we call it concern, when he questions her every decision. We frame it as love, when he insists on joining activities she'd prefer to do alone. We disguise it as partnership, when he finds ways to make himself indispensable to tasks she handled perfectly well before he arrived. The psychology here is deliciously twisted, like watching a magician who's forgotten he's performing tricks and started believing in his own magic. Recent studies in relationship dynamics show that men with higher dependency needs are more likely to perceive their partner's independence as rejection, even when it has nothing to do with them. Their brains literally rewire intimacy to mean fusion, autonomy to mean abandonment. But here's where it gets properly sinister. He doesn't consciously decide to undermine her independence. It happens through 1,000 tiny erosions, each one so small she can't quite name it as sabotage. He offers to handle tasks she enjoys doing herself. He expresses worry about her solo adventures until she starts declining them to keep the peace. He becomes hurt when she makes plans that don't include him, not because he wants to join, but because her ability to imagine happiness without him threatens the entire foundation of his self-worth. I've watched this slow-motion assassination of autonomy play out like a Greek tragedy. The woman starts strong, self-reliant, gloriously independent. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, she begins to shrink. Not because he demands it. He's too clever for such obvious tyranny. Instead, he creates an emotional climate where her independence feels like cruelty, where her self-sufficiency becomes evidence that she doesn't love him enough. The most diabolical part? He genuinely believes he's the victim in this scenario. She becomes selfish for maintaining friendships he's not part of, cold for not needing his constant validation, difficult for having opinions that diverge from his. Her strength, which once attracted him like a moth to flame, now burns him, and he can't understand why she won't dim herself to accommodate his comfort. There's something almost Kafkaesque about being on trial for crimes you don't remember committing. She finds herself apologizing for things that aren't wrong, for being competent, for having her own interests, for existing as a complete human being rather than half of a couple. The accusation is never stated directly, but it hangs in the air like smoke. You don't need me enough, and that makes you dangerous. Schopenhauer wrote about the will to live as a blind, irrational force that drives all human behavior. But what happens when one person's will to live is so anemic, so dependent on external validation, that another person's vitality becomes an existential threat? He can't strengthen his own life force, so he sets about weakening hers, drop by drop, day by day, until she's as hollow and dependent as he's always been. The witch trials weren't really about magic. They were about power, about communities so threatened by female autonomy that they'd rather burn women alive than face their own inadequacy. The modern version is subtler, but no less devastating. Instead of stakes and fire, we use guilt and emotional manipulation. Instead of accusation of consorting with devils, we accuse them of not caring enough, of being too independent, of threatening the natural order of things. And the most heartbreaking part? Sometimes it works. Sometimes the strong woman, exhausted by the constant trial, begins to believe she might be guilty of something after all. She starts second-guessing her instincts, seeking his approval for decisions she used to make without hesitation, slowly transforming from witch to willing participant in her own diminishment. The tragedy isn't just hers, it's his too. Because in his desperate attempt to make himself necessary, he destroys the very thing that made her worth having in the first place. He gets his dependent woman, his validation of his importance, his proof that he matters. But what he's left holding is an empty shell, a shadow of the person who once challenged and inspired him. Have you been the prosecutor in this trial? Have you mistaken someone's independence for abandonment, their strength for rejection? Or perhaps you've been the accused, slowly shrinking yourself to fit someone else's need to feel important. Which role feels more familiar, and what does that tell you about the person you've become? The mirror that refuses to lie. In her clarity, he sees not his reflection, but his absence. There's a moment, you'll know it when it happens, when a strong woman looks at you with absolute clarity and you realize, with sick certainty, that she sees exactly who you are. Not who you pretend to be, not who you're trying to become, not even who you were before life carved out the soft parts and left you hollow. She sees the actual you, the compromises you've made with your own integrity, the dreams you've abandoned for the illusion of security, the ways you've betrayed your younger self's vision of who you'd grow up to be. And it's terrifying. Most people offer us the mercy of their own blindness. They see what they want to see, what they need to see, what serves their own psychological narrative. We live in a world of mutually agreed-upon illusions, each of us playing along with everyone else's performance because we need them to play along with ours. It's a comfortable conspiracy of selective vision, but strong women, God help us, they develop a different kind of sight altogether. Perhaps it's because they've had to see clearly to survive, to navigate a world that's constantly trying to diminish them. Perhaps it's because they've done their own inner work and can recognize authenticity, or its absence, from 1,000 yards away. Whatever the source, they possess an almost supernatural ability to cut through pretense like light through fog. I remember a man who told me about the moment his relationship ended, though it took 6 more months for either of them to admit it. They were at dinner, discussing his job, and she said quietly, "You hate your work, don't you?" Not accusingly, not trying to fix anything, just seeing. He'd spent 2 years telling everyone, including himself, how grateful he was for his position, how it provided stability, how he was building towards something meaningful. But she saw through the performance to the slow death happening underneath. "I don't hate it," he lied, and they both knew he was lying, and in that moment something irreparable shifted between them. Because she had offered him the gift of being seen truly, and he had chosen to remain hidden. She had held up a mirror, and he had insisted it was showing him someone else. The neuroscience of self-deception is fascinating in its complexity. Our brains are remarkably adept at filtering information that threatens our self-concept, literally rewiring neural pathways to avoid uncomfortable truths. But when someone else's clarity penetrates our carefully constructed blindness, the cognitive dissonance creates something like psychological vertigo. We experience it as aggression, even when it's offered with love. This is why men often describe strong women as judgmental or critical, when what they're actually experiencing is someone who won't participate in their self-deception. She's not judging him. She's simply refusing to unsee what she's already seen. And for someone who spent years cultivating a false self, being seen clearly feels like being flayed alive. The most painful part isn't even the exposure of his flaws. It's the recognition of his unrealized potential. She sees not just who he is, but who he could become if he stopped hiding from himself. And that gap between reality and possibility becomes a chasm of shame that threatens to swallow him whole. There's something almost mythological about this dynamic. In Greek legend, Perseus could only defeat Medusa by looking at her reflection in his polished shield, because meeting her gaze directly would turn him to stone. Strong women are similar. They show men truths so stark that direct confrontation feels impossible. The reflection is too clear, too honest, too revealing of everything they've spent their lives avoiding. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn, like finding a hidden door in a house you thought you knew completely. Sometimes, very rarely, a man will choose to look directly into that mirror instead of smashing it. He'll let himself be seen completely, flaws and failures, and abandoned dreams and all. And in those moments of radical honesty, something extraordinary happens. He begins to exist. Not the performed version, not the carefully curated self, but the actual person he's been hiding from everyone, including himself. It's terrifying and liberating in equal measure, like being born at 30 or 40 or 50 years old, finally emerging from a cocoon of pretense he'd forgotten he was wrapped in. The strong woman doesn't cause this transformation. She simply provides the condition where it becomes possible. She creates a space where authenticity is not only tolerated but required, where pretense dies of neglect and truth becomes the only currency that holds value. Most men run from this space. They find women who will participate in their self-deception, who will love their performance instead of demanding their presence. And they call this compatibility, never realizing they've chosen comfort over growth, illusion over intimacy. The familiar pain of hiding over the unfamiliar terror of being known. But the ones who stay, who choose to be seen clearly despite the discomfort, who allow her clarity to become their own. They discover something that makes all the previous pain seem like a small price to pay. They discover that being truly seen by another person is the closest thing to resurrection available to the living. When was the last time you allowed yourself to be seen completely? Not the version of yourself you think others want, but the raw, unedited truth of who you are in your most honest moments. Are you brave enough to find someone who won't look away? Or have you become too attached to your own performance to risk such radical intimacy? The graveyard of borrowed selves. In learning to be alone, he discovers the corpses of all the men he thought he had to be. The final truth, spoken like a prayer for the dying. There comes a night, it might be next week, next year, or 20 years from now, when you'll find yourself sitting alone in a room that feels simultaneously too small and too vast, surrounded by the artifacts of a life you're not sure you actually chose. The books you bought to impress people whose opinions no longer matter. The clothes that make you look like someone you thought you should be. The furniture that speaks of stability you've never felt, success you've never believed in, a version of masculinity that fits you like a borrowed suit. And in that moment of terrible clarity, you'll realize you've been living in a graveyard. Not of other people, but of all the selves you killed to become acceptable. The boy who wanted to dance instead of play football. The young man who wrote poetry before he learned it wasn't masculine. The dreamer who traded his vision for a paycheck, his authenticity for approval, his soul for the illusion of safety. This is what strong women threaten most deeply. Not your pride, not your control, not even your ego. They threaten your graveyard. Because they refuse to mourn for selves you voluntarily murdered. Refuse to pretend that your self-inflicted amputation was anything other than a choice. They look at you with that devastating clarity and see not the man you've convinced yourself you had to become, but all the men you chose not to be. I knew a man once who spent 40 years playing the part of someone else's son, someone else's idea of a husband, someone else's definition of success. He wore suits that strangled him, spoke in voices that weren't his own, laughed at jokes that made him sick to his stomach. And then he met a woman who had the audacity to be herself completely, messy, imperfect, gloriously unashamed of her contradictions, and suddenly his performance felt like a death sentence. "She makes me feel like a fraud," he confessed to me over whiskey that tasted like regret. "Not because she does anything wrong, but because she's so real. And being around real makes me realize I don't know who I am anymore." The psychology of this is brutally simple. We can only maintain our false selves in the presence of other false selves. It's a mutual conspiracy of pretense, each of us agreeing to love the other's performance in exchange for applause for our own. But authenticity is contagious, and for someone who's forgotten how to be real, exposure to the genuine article can feel like a kind of death. Because it is a kind of death. The death of the carefully constructed persona. The death of the borrowed identity. The death of all the ways we've learned to be lovable instead of learning to be ourselves. And most of us are so identified with our false selves that this death feels like annihilation rather than liberation. But here's the secret that only comes to those brave enough to let their borrowed selves die. On the other side of that death is not nothingness, but something far more terrifying and wonderful. There's you. The actual you. The one who's been buried under decades of shoulds and supposed tos and have to be's. The one who remembers what you loved before you learned what you were supposed to love, who you were before you decided who you needed to be. Strong women don't fear this graveyard. They've walked through their own. They've killed off the good girl, the people-pleaser, the one who shrinks to make others comfortable. They've done the brutal work of excavating their authentic selves from under the rubble of others' expectations. And they expect you to do the same work, not because they're demanding, but because anything less than authenticity feels like a betrayal of the very concept of intimacy. The most profound loneliness isn't being alone. It's being surrounded by people who love someone you're not. It's the isolation of performance, the exhaustion of always being on stage, the desperate hunger for someone to see past your act to the person you've forgotten how to be. This is why solitude becomes sacred for men who are ready to stop running from themselves. Not the solitude of avoidance or depression, but the chosen solitude of excavation. The deliberate decision to spend time with the person you actually are instead of the person you think you should be. To listen to your own thoughts instead of the constant commentary of others. To rediscover your own preferences, your own rhythms, your own voice speaking in its original accent. There's something almost mystical about watching a man remember himself. I've seen it happen, the moment when years of borrowed personality fall away like old clothes, and suddenly there's someone home behind the eyes. It's like watching a resurrection, a return from the dead, a person stepping out of their own shadow into sunlight they'd forgotten existed. The strong woman who triggered this awakening might not even be there to witness it. Often she's long gone, having served her purpose as catalyst without ever meaning to. But her refusal to love his false self becomes the gift that keeps giving. The mirror that wouldn't lie. The standard of authenticity that makes performance impossible. The example of what it looks like to be courageously, devastatingly real. And in the end, this is the liberation that comes when you stop chasing what destroys you. You discover that what you were chasing was never real anyway. The approval of people whose opinions don't matter. The love of those who only knew your performance. The validation of a world that profits from your self-betrayal. What remains after all the borrowed selves have died is something infinitely more valuable. The possibility of being loved for who you actually are. Not who you pretend to be, Not who you think you should be, but who you've always been underneath the costume. And that person, the real you, has been waiting your entire life for the courage to step into the light. So here we are, at the end of all our dark truths, and I ask you this. Which of your borrowed selves are you ready to bury? What would happen if you stopped performing masculinity and started inhabiting it? Who would you be if you had the courage to disappoint everyone who loves your false self in order to discover everyone who might love your real one?